Today, you will hear the story of the most important exploratory expedition in the southwest United States, the expedition of Coronado. A number of events led up to Coronado's explorations, involving the careers of two other explorers, Panfilo Narvaez and Cabeza de Vaca. Let us begin by recounting the achievements and misfortunes of these two men. Spanish exploration into the southwest began with the wreck of the expedition of Panfilo Narvaez off the coast of Texas. Narvaez and his men were trying to reach Mexico from the coast of Florida. While on an expedition into the interior of Florida, they had been abandoned as dead by their companions, who sailed away, leaving them without any means to return to Spanish territory. Narvaez and his men decided to build small boats and try to reach Mexico. It was during this journey to Mexico that they were hit by a storm. Narvaez was killed during the storm, and Cabeza de Vaca assumed command. He decided that they should land on the Texas coast for a time before continuing the journey to Mexico. However, they found little food to eat in this desert territory, and soon they were too weak to take up the journey again. Indians found the Spaniards starving as winter approached. The Spaniards begged for help from the Indians, but did not obtain much food from them. They grew weaker and weaker. And before the winter was over, the Spaniards resorted to cannibalism. They had nearly gone mad from hunger, and when one of their number died, he was quickly eaten by the others. Nonetheless, a few of them survived the winter, including deVaca. In the spring, the 15 remaining Spaniards were seized for slaves by the Indians, who blamed them for the plague. Most probably, this was only an excuse on the Indians' part, but in any case, the Spaniards were too weak to resist. For 7 years, deVaca was a slave of various Indian tribes throughout the West. He was put to work hoeing and harvesting corn crops, carrying loads and other tiring jobs. Frequently, he wondered why he continued making the effort to stay alive, but somehow he managed to stick it out and survive. A slight knowledge of medicine aided him in gaining a reputation for healing the sick. He could set broken bones and recommend remedies for fevers. Soon many rich Indians began to seek him out for help. His workload lightened, and he began to dream of trying to escape. But how could one man alone hope to cross the great distances between this wilderness and the settled Spanish territory? Thus deVaca's slavery continued. His traveling brought him to the edge of the Great Plains. The majesty of these vast lands, extending as far as the eye could see, made a strong impression on deVaca. But there was another surprise in store for him. His party was joined by another group of Indians and their slaves. And he met the last survivors of the Narvaez expedition, Castillo, Dorantes and Estevanico, a Moor. The men were overjoyed to see each other, but their situation could hardly be described as ideal. The Indians had also enslaved the 3 others. There really seemed to be no future for any of the 4 men. deVaca and his companions were still slaves in spite of his reputation as a medicine man. They could think of no way to escape from their captors. They only hoped that they would not be separated again. Their situation seemed more tolerable as long as they were together. This situation continued until a party of slave-hunting Spaniards rescued them from the Indians. deVaca and his 3 companions could hardly believe their good fortune. After so many years of bondage, they had lost all hope of ever returning to civilization. But the soldiers gladly took them back to Mexico, where they might begin living like free men again. In Mexico City, deVaca told of the 7 cities of Cibola, which he had heard of from the Indians. These cities were supposed to be fabulously wealthy. The Indians located them somewhere to the north of known territory. People began to talk of forming an expedition to go and search for them. deVaca actually had little faith in his own stories. His real interests lay elsewhere. He sought permission to lead an expedition to Florida. After being refused the grant to conquer Florida, deVaca endured the hardships of Argentina, later returning to Spain, where he died. His voyages of exploration came to an end. Now others had to take up where he had left off. Francisco Coronado, the governor of western Mexico, had listened eagerly to deVaca's stories. He tended to believe that the 7 cities of Cibola did exist. He would be quite pleased to find them, for his province would thereby become the richest one in the New World. He decided that the story was worth investigating. Coronado sent Estevanico with a friar, Marcos, to investigate the 7 golden cities of Cibola. He was not ready to invest money in a full-scale expedition. He instructed the 2 men to learn what they could and to return to Mexico when they had found the cities. The 2 men set out confidently upon their journey. Traveling north into New Mexico, Friar Marcos was disturbed by Estevanico's conceit and the resentment of the Indians. Perhaps as a reaction to his long period of enslavement, Estevanico treated them arrogantly and earned their hatred for himself and Friar Marcos. Friar Marcos began to worry about the voyage's chances for success. The friar's fears were realized. Estevanico, going alone to Cibola, was killed outside the city walls. The Indians would not deal with the haughty Moor. He fell victim to his own excessive pride. Afraid to go on, Friar Marcos glimpsed Cibola from afar. The Indian pueblo became a golden city to his optimistic imagination. He felt sure that its tall towers and walls guarded the greatest treasures in North America, but it would require a full-fledged expedition if the city was to be taken. The friar decided that it was time to return to Coronado and tell him what he had seen. After a long journey, he reached Mexico and convinced the governor that the expedition would be worthwhile. All Mexico wanted to join Coronado in exploring the 7 cities after hearing the friar's tale. Adventurers flocked from all parts of the country to join the expedition. They dreamed of an inexhaustible supply of gold, which they were sure would be found in these legendary cities. In February 1540, the expedition started out. The journey did not present too many difficulties, but the going was slow because of the large numbers involved and because of the necessity of transporting baggage and supplies. Every day they looked toward the northern horizon in search of the golden cities. 6 months later, they arrived to find the wealthy city was only an Indian pueblo. Trouble ensued between Spaniard and Indian. The Spaniards were terribly disappointed to learn that the walls of the city were made of mud rather than gold, but they were determined to take possession of it anyway. The Indians were equally determined to drive the Spaniards away. In the battle that followed, Coronado was almost killed when hit by a stone. It was necessary for him to retire from the battle and receive proper care for his wound. But weapons such as stones and arrows were useless in the long run against the Spanish firearms. And eventually, the Indians were forced to yield. Capturing the pueblo, the Spaniards found badly needed food, but no treasure. The legendary wealth of Cibola was only a myth. The expedition now seemed pointless. the Spaniards paused for a short rest in the city they had captured. As he recovered from his wounds, Coronado was undecided what to do next. His common sense told him to return to Mexico and give up his quest. But when he thought of the money and lives which had already been invested in the journey, he was hesitant to give up so quickly. Who could tell what lay just beyond the next mountain? Coronado decided to make another effort to find gold in North America. He sent small groups in different directions, many of them making great discoveries. Since Coronado really had no idea where to begin looking for gold, he decided it made the best sense to send out a number of small expeditions to different areas. The first group to find something worthwhile would return and inform the others, so that all could then proceed to the location of the valuable discovery. As it turned out, the small groups were unsuccessful in finding any treasure, but they did make other fascinating discoveries. All of these were reported to Coronado. In 1540, Cardenas, one of his lieutenants, discovered the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. The Spaniards were awestruck by the majesty of these sheer rock faces, dyed in every color of the rainbow, but the Grand Canyon had no gold. Alvarado's group discovered bisons, which they described as hump-backed cows. This discovery had some importance because it was found that the bison, or buffaloes, were a good source of fresh meat, always a problem on extended journeys. On the other hand, no herds of wild horses were ever seen by the Spaniards. It may be that escaped horses from the expedition were the first the Indians ever used. We do know that the Indians had never seen horses before the Spaniards came to the New World. This was one of the reasons why they were easy to defeat. However, explorers who came after Coronado noticed that large herds of wild horses were to be found throughout the Southwest. It is presumed that they had escaped from the first Spanish expeditions and multiplied rapidly to form large herds, which exist even to our own day. By 1700, many Indians were mounted and therefore hard to capture. Imitating the European invaders, they had domesticated wild horses and began using them in hunting and in battle. Eventually, an Indian's wealth was based on the number of horses he owned. Periodic raids on the wild herds constantly replenished the Indian supply of horses. These horses were called mestengos by the Spaniards, meaning of mixed breed. This word has come into the English language as mustang, and such horses are still referred to with this name. But let us return to Coronado's expedition. Coronado moved northeast to Tiguex in bitter cold weather. He was still hoping to find the treasures of the Indians, but the icy winds took a heavy toll of the numbers of the Spanish. Coronado sought shelter in the city of Tiguex. Here he met friendly Indians. These Indians never had seen Spaniards before and did not imagine that they meant them any harm. They willingly offered shelter to Coronado's men and did not seek to engage them in battle. A Pawnee, whom they called the Turk, told Coronado of Cibola, a wealthy city to the north. He said that he had seen it and that it was the wealthiest city on the world. Coronado became very interested in the Pawnee's story. It was obvious that Tiguex had no wealth, but perhaps Cibola was as rich as the Turk said. While Coronado was away in the spring, the Tiguex Indians revolted against Spanish brutality. The Spanish soldiers were used to mistreating hostile Indians, and they made no exception for those who had treated them with kindness. But the Tiguex Indians, despite the justice of their cause, could not hold out against Spanish muskets. The Indians surrendered after the Spaniards promised them no harm. But Cardenas, commanding in Coronado's absence, treacherously ordered their leaders burned. This act of injustice outraged the Indians. They began fighting once more. The Indians, bare-handed, tried to defend themselves and were wiped out by the armed Spaniards. This was the payment which they received for having welcomed the Spanish soldiers with kindness. Horrified at what had been done, Coronado decided to lead the Spanish from Tiguex to explore Quivira. The very walls of the city seemed to reproach him for what his soldiers had done in his absence. But there was nothing to do to right this wrong, so he doggedly continued the journey. There was not enough food to last until they reached Quivira, northern Kansas. The barren plains offered no nourishment to Coronado's troops, and the supplies they carried with them would clearly give out soon. Because of the shortage of food, he sent home all but 30 horsemen, 6 foot soldiers, and the Turk. He knew that a small band like this could travel faster than the whole expedition. The small group pushed onward, waving goodbye to the men they had left behind. Arriving at Quivira, they found only grass-thatched huts. Angry, they seized the Turk, who admitted he had hoped to lead Coronado to destruction, whereupon the Spanish strangled him. They had made this long, tiring journey only to find a village even poorer than Tiguex. Coronado's rage knew no bounds. He did not regret having punished the Turk. The Spanish leader no longer believed that he would find any treasure. Discouraged, Coronado started back to Tiguex. He and his men retraced their steps southward over the vast, silent plains, empty of any witnesses save the impassive, mute bisons. Finally, they arrived at the city of Tiguex, where they spent a cold, hard winter. Coronado only wished to return to Mexico and give up the wild goose chase after gold. But he knew that such a journey wasn't possible until the winter storms had calmed and given way to spring. He stamped about in the snow, filled with bitterness over the multiple failures of his expedition. In December, Coronado fell under an officer's horse, and his head was injured. This was the second head wound he received in the past few years, and no one expected him to survive it. In fact, he remained near death until spring, but finally recovered. Despite all his failures, he had not quite lost the will to live. He longed to leave these untamed territories and give up the thankless task of seeking after gold. Soon he was well enough to leave, and all the preparations for departure were made. Anxious to get home, he ordered his men south to Mexico. He gave one last look at the silent lands at his back and resolutely began the return trip southward. Finally, Coronado and his surviving soldiers reached Mexico, where he reported his failure. The royal authorities were disappointed that such a promising expedition had yielded no treasure, but they were nonetheless interested in Coronado's descriptions of the things he had seen. Also, the expanded knowledge concerning the geography of the territories to the north, which he brought back, was most useful to them. Coronado, unlike other explorers, lived comfortably in Mexico several years before he died. He had no desire to make further exploratory voyages. He was content to relate the dangers and hardships of the journey he had already made to whomever was interested in listening. He hardly realized the value of his explorations and regarded them as failures. Today we know better, and so our first knowledge of Central and Southwestern United States came from the expedition of Francisco Coronado. After his trip, all of the areas indicated on the map could be considered parts of the known world. If Coronado were alive today, he would doubtless see that the contribution he made in pushing back the frontiers of the unknown was much more valuable than any gold he might have brought back.